As the waves whispered softly against the shores of Whispering Isle, Poirot considered how mysteries often linger far longer than the events themselves. For have you ever noticed how certain lessons embed themselves quietly in the mind, shaping thought, influencing behavior, and subtly guiding decisions without anyone noticing? Because here, on this small, isolated isle, the whispers had done precisely that, awakening awareness, prompting reflection, and stirring memory that had long been ignored. And Poirot, with his habitual precision, observed how these quiet interventions had reshaped daily life. The deliberate gestures, the measured conversations, the careful attention to corners that had once been overlooked. And is it not remarkable how invisible influence can be more profound than visible action? How repetition, timing, and subtle guidance can awaken insight far more effectively than revelation or accusation. And the whispers themselves, though now silent, left an enduring impression, a soft insistence that the past, however politely forgotten, cannot be fully ignored, that conscience, once stirred, demands recognition. And Poirot, watching the interplay of light and shadow on the isle, realized that the genius of this mystery lay not in exposing wrongs or identifying culprits, but in transforming perception, in creating a persistent awareness that would ripple through behavior long after the last whisper had faded. And perhaps the most extraordinary truth of all is that some mysteries do not end with answers. They endure quietly, invisibly, reshaping minds, embedding lessons, and reminding those who listen that the softest sounds often carry the greatest wisdom, leaving us forever more vigilant, forever more reflective, and forever more attuned to the subtle truths that lie beneath the ordinary surface of life. And as night fully settled over Whispering Isle, Poirot reflected on the nature of influence and the invisible forces that shape lives. For have you ever noticed how a tiny, persistent nudge can alter behavior more than any overt warning? How subtle reminders leave impressions that are remembered long after the source is gone? Because the whispers of the isle had not been about fear, nor accusation, nor punishment, but about awakening, about coaxing conscience and attention without ever raising a voice. And in observing this, Poirot saw something far more remarkable than any criminal pattern. He saw the delicate interplay of human memory, neglect, and the power of suggestion. For each whisper had found its listener at precisely the moment when reflection was possible. And is it not strange how awareness can be most effective when it arrives quietly, unobtrusively, almost like a breeze passing through an open window, yet altering everything it touches? And the islanders, in their subtle adjustments, the careful closing of doors, the thoughtful pauses in conversation, the lingering glances at familiar places, had become unwitting participants in a lesson they had never asked to learn. And Poirot, always meticulous, noted how the past, once brushed aside or forgotten, returned in these moments with an almost polite insistence, shaping behavior more thoroughly than force or confrontation ever could. And the whispers themselves, now nearly imperceptible, had already accomplished their work, leaving behind an awareness that would persist long after the sound had vanished. And it struck Poirot that some mysteries are not solved in the conventional sense, for the resolution lies not in uncovering a secret, but in the quiet imprint left on those who have listened, the realization that life itself, like the isle, responds to observation, to patience, to subtle guidance. And as he gazed across the still waters reflecting a sky now dotted with stars, he understood. Poirot prepared to depart Whispering Isle. He reflected on a subtle truth that often escapes the impatient mind, that mysteries are not merely solved, but absorbed. And have you ever noticed how a seemingly small observation, a whispered remark, or a fleeting shadow can linger far longer than a dramatic revelation? Because here, on this small, windswept isle, the true power of the whispers lay not in their sound, but in their effect, in the way they nudged thoughts, guided choices, and forced reflection where none had existed before. And it was in observing these delicate transformations that Poirot understood the elegance of the orchestration, how each whisper had been placed with intention, each pause calculated to maximize consideration without provoking panic, each moment of uncertainty designed to let the mind wander into possibilities that have been hidden in plain sight. And as he traced the patterns in his mind, he realized that human behavior itself was the most intricate puzzle of all, far more revealing than any clue left behind. For the whispers had revealed more about the islanders than about the mystery itself, their fears, regrets, and unspoken truths exposed not through confrontation, but through patient suggestion. And do we not all respond in such quiet ways to unseen pressures, to words unspoken but understood, to histories we prefer to forget but that insist upon return? And Poirot, accustomed to noticing the smallest anomaly, now saw how the whispers had altered the very rhythm of life on the isle, shaping interactions, curbing impulsive speech, and guiding reflection. And as he left the shore, watching the waves roll silently against rocks that had witnessed generations of human pretense and concealment, he realized that a case's end is never in its solution alone, but in the lasting awareness it leaves behind, a subtle, invisible imprint on minds that listened closely enough. And perhaps, if we ourselves are attentive, we may hear such ears, whispers, asterisk, asterisk. And as the night deepened over Whispering Isle, Poirot allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. For have you ever noticed how some lessons leave no outward mark, yet quietly reshape everything, guiding thought, attention, and even the smallest gestures? Because here on this island, the whispers have performed a subtle choreography, invisible to anyone who did not pay close attention, teaching patience, vigilance, and introspection through repetition rather than force. And Poirot, with his customary eye for detail, observed how the islanders had begun to move with a new awareness, not fearfully, but deliberately, weighing words and actions, glancing toward corners where shadows lingered, and considering what had previously been forgotten or ignored. And is it not remarkable how an idea can spread without being spoken aloud, how reflection can be cultivated quietly, patiently, until it becomes part of the very rhythm of life? And the whispers themselves, though now silent, had achieved their purpose, not by exposing guilt or error, but by inviting recognition, by guiding understanding without imposing it. And Poirot, contemplating the elegant precision of this invisible instruction, recognized that true mastery of mystery lies not in revelation alone, but in the careful shaping of perception, in the transformation of awareness, in the way memory and attention can be directed without anyone realizing they're being guided. And as he watched the moonlight ripple across the water, illuminating the rocks and paths that had held centuries of secret histories, he understood that the ultimate lesson of Whispering Isle was a reminder that some truths do not demand drama or confrontation, but settle quietly into the consciousness of those who notice, teaching vigilance, shaping conscience, and leaving an indelible impression that persists long after the last sound has faded. And perhaps, if one listens carefully enough in life, one might encounter whispers of, "Theirs." Asterisk, asterisk, what is it about a whisper that unsettles us more than a shout? And why do certain places seem to murmur only when they believe no one is listening? And have you ever wondered what might happen if an island itself appeared to have a voice, low, persistent, and impossibly knowing, because Whispering Isle was such a place, a fragment of land where sound behaved badly and silence never stayed silent for long? And it was to this curious setting that Hercule Poirot's attention was eventually drawn, not by panic or spectacle, but by something far more troubling: consistency. For the whispers did not come in moments of drama, but in moments of calm, arriving with the same restraint one might expect from a well-mannered guest who knocked politely before entering the mind. And that alone was enough to trouble Poirot, who had long understood that true disturbances rarely announce themselves loudly. And as reports accumulated, never exaggerated, never hysterical, always careful and restrained, the pattern began to form. For the whispers were heard at similar hours, in similar conditions, and always when those who heard them were alone with their thoughts. And is it not curious how fear prefers solitude, how it grows bolder when it believes it has a single audience, And as others dismissed these accounts as imagination or old tales clinging to damp stone and sea air, Poirot listened instead to what was not being said, to the pauses in conversation, to the careful way. Certain details were avoided, and he noted how habits subtly changed, how doors were closed sooner than before, how lights were left burning just a little longer, and how people began to speak more softly, as though afraid of being overheard by something that had no visible form. And here the Isle's history offered no comfort, only a succession of half-remembered events and politely forgotten incidents, each one insignificant on its own, yet deeply suggestive when considered together. And Poirot, with his précis, asterisk, and as Poirot's silhouette faded into the distance, leaving Whispering Isle behind, he could not shake the thought that the true power of a mystery lies not in the revelation of events, but in the transformation it leaves in its wake. For have you ever wondered how a place, a moment, or even a subtle sound can alter the way we perceive ourselves, how it nudges habits, thoughts, and memories in ways so quiet that we scarcely notice until weeks, months, even years later? And it was this very principle that had guided the Whispers of the Isle, carefully calibrated to awaken reflection, to expose the unspoken, to turn the past into a teacher rather than a burden. And Poirot, observing the empty docks and the soft lapping of water against rocks worn smooth by time, noted how the islanders had already begun to move differently, speak differently, live differently. And is it not extraordinary how the smallest interventions, a whisper here, a pause there, can ripple through lives, like an unseen tide, reshaping the ordinary into something that demands attention, that insists upon mindfulness? And he thought, too, of those who had dismissed the whispers, for even they carried a shadow of awareness now, a subtle unease that reminded them that not everything could be ignored, not everything could be forgotten, and in that quiet persistence lay the genius of the design, for true mystery never shouts. It simply waits, nudges, and teaches without announcing itself. And Poirot, whose life had been spent noticing what others overlooked, understood that this case would linger in his mind as it would in theirs, a testament to the patient, deliberate influence of observation, suggestion, and reflection. And as the last light faded over the water, he smiled softly to himself, knowing that the Isle had spoken, that lessons had been absorbed, and that some mysteries, though concluded in events, never truly end. They live on quietly, gently, persistently, in every pause. And as Poirot finally turned his back on Whispering Isle, the early morning sun glinting softly on the calm waters, he understood that some mysteries do not end with revelation or confrontation. For have you ever considered how the quietest events, the faintest whispers, can linger far longer than the loudest deeds, shaping thought, attention, and conscience in ways that cannot be undone? Because here, on this small, windswept isle, the whispers had done more than unsettle. They had awakened awareness, cultivated reflection, and guided behavior with precision that was invisible yet undeniable. And Poirot, ever meticulous, observed how the islanders had absorbed these lessons subtly, through small gestures, considered words, and deliberate silences, how the rhythm of daily life had shifted in response to a truth no one had spoken aloud. And is it not remarkable how influence, delivered patiently, persistently, and almost imperceptibly, can teach more than confrontation ever could? How repetition and timing can awaken understanding, reshape conscience, and leave an enduring imprint on memory. And the whispers themselves, now entirely gone, had left behind a presence felt in every careful step, every thoughtful pause, every glance that lingered a moment longer than before. And as Poirot reflected on the elegance of this quiet orchestration, he realized that the true power of mystery lies not in exposure, but in transformation, in the subtle ways it reshapes lives, in the awareness it implants quietly, persistently, in minds willing to listen. And perhaps, if we ourselves are attentive, we too can hear such whispers in our own lives, reminders that understanding often arrives softly, invisibly, and with patient insistence, teaching us that some mysteries never truly end. They live on in memory, reflection, and the quiet, deliberate attention we bring to the world, leaving us forever changed, forever aware, and forever more conscious of the truths that dwell just. And as the first hint of dawn began to touch the horizon, Poirot's thoughts lingered on the subtle artistry of the whispers. For have you ever considered how influence, when delivered with patience and precision, can be more powerful than force, more enduring than confrontation? Because on whispering, all the lessons were never shouted, never demanded, yet they reshaped lives in ways both visible and imperceptible, guiding decisions, fostering reflection, and awakening memory long suppressed. And Poirot, as always meticulous, noted how the islanders had absorbed these lessons quietly, how habits shifted almost imperceptibly, how conversations carried a new weight, how pauses became deliberate, as though every gesture now had meaning beyond itself. And is it not strange how a single, consistent signal can teach more effectively than 100 words? How repetition and timing can awaken understanding in ways that shock or accusation never could. And in this quiet mastery, Poirot recognized the extraordinary balance between subtlety and intention, between restraint and effect, for the whispers had acted not as instruments of fear, but as tools of reflection, prompting each listener to confront truths long avoided. And as he observed the gentle stirring of life across the isle, the glimmer of early light on water, the cautious steps of those who had heard, now moving with an almost imperceptible caution, he understood that the true resolution of a mystery is rarely in the act of uncovering, but in the lasting transformation it leaves behind, a quiet imprint upon behavior, memory, and conscience. And as the isle basked in the soft morning glow, Poirot realized that the whispers had accomplished what words could not. They had taught, corrected, and revealed without spectacle, leaving behind an awareness that would endure, a soft, invisible echo in every corner of the island. A reminder that some mysteries are less about answers than about what they leave quietly, patiently. Ears. Have you ever visited a place so quiet, so seemingly ordinary, that even a whisper can feel like a secret? What if those whispers were not just sound, but a guide, a lesson shaping thought, behavior, and memory without anyone noticing? On Whispering Isle, a series of faint murmurs unsettled the islanders. But why? And who was behind them? Could a community be quietly taught by whispers alone, without confrontation, fear, or punishment? And how did Hercule Poirot, the master of deduction, unravel a mystery that spoke in silence rather than words? Stay with us, because what you think is ordinary may hide a secret that changes everything. Ears. And as Poirot walked along the departing path from Whispering Isle, he allowed himself a rare contemplation. For have you ever realized how the smallest, most consistent disturbances can leave a far deeper impression than any sudden revelation? How subtle patterns, repeated patiently, can teach lessons the loudest proclamations never could. Because here, on this remote isle, the whispers had accomplished more than mere intrigue. They had awakened awareness, guided reflection, and compelled attention without ever raising their voices. And Poirot, ever precise, noted the profound ways in which these lessons had shaped the islanders' lives, how movements had become more deliberate, conversations more considered, how old fears had transformed into careful vigilance. And do we not all carry similar unseen influences in our lives? Quiet nudges that shape thought and behavior without announcement, without drama, yet with remarkable effectiveness. And the whispers themselves, now absent, had left a presence, a soft, enduring insistence that the past could not be ignored and that conscience, once awakened, demands acknowledgement. And as he observed the gentle motion of the water, the way sunlight touched familiar rocks, the unspoken rhythms of the isle adjusting to its new awareness, Poirot realized that the true mastery of the mystery lay not in discovery, but in transformation, not in revelation, but in subtle, persistent guidance. For the greatest mysteries, he understood, are those that linger quietly, reshaping understanding, adjusting perception, embedding themselves into the habits, thoughts, and memories of those who pay attention. And perhaps the most extraordinary lesson of all is this: that mysteries do not always end with answers. They endure in reflection, in awareness, and in the quiet, invisible shifts that teach vigilance, patience, and comprehension in ways that sound, noise, or confrontation could never achieve, leaving those who listen forever changed. Ears. Have you ever visited a place so quiet, so seemingly ordinary, that even a whisper can feel like a secret? What if those whispers were not just sound, but a guide, a lesson, shaping thought, behavior, and memory without anyone noticing? On Whispering Isle, a series of faint murmurs unsettled the islanders. But why? And who was behind them? Could a community be quietly taught by whispers alone, without confrontation, fear, or punishment? And how did Hercule Poirot, the master of deduction, unravel a mystery that spoke in silence rather than words? Stay with us, because what you think is ordinary may hide a secret that changes everything. Ears. And as the final hints of twilight faded into a deep, velvet night over Whispering Isle, Poirot considered the extraordinary patience required for a mystery to teach itself. For have you ever wondered why some lessons are most enduring not when shouted, but when whispered, repeated gently, almost imperceptibly? And does that not mirror the way our own memories nudge us in quiet moments, long after the world has moved on? Because the whispers of the Isle had done more than awaken curiosity. They had reshaped perception, reminding each listener that attention, reflection, and even subtle fear can guide action far more effectively than any overt warning. And Poirot, with his accustomed precision, observed how those small, almost invisible adjustments, how doors were closed more carefully, how words were chosen with deliberate weight, how glances lingered a moment longer at familiar corners, revealed a truth far more profound than the mystery itself: that humans respond not only to facts, but to suggestion, timing, and intention. And is it not remarkable how a simple, consistent pattern can alter lives without anyone truly noticing? How something as quiet as a whisper can teach vigilance, honesty, and recognition in ways that force and confrontation cannot. And as Poirot traced these subtle ripples in behavior back to their source, he understood the ingenuity behind them. How the mystery had been carefully designed to awaken reflection, to prod conscience, to stir memories long neglected. And though the audible whispers had faded, their effect persisted, lingering in the rhythm of daily life, in the hesitation before words, in the pause between gestures, a constant reminder that the past, however carefully hidden, will find a way to assert itself. And as the night deepened and stars scattered across the sky like distant lanterns, Poirot realized that the true lesson of Whispering Isle was not the solution itself, but the enduring, invisible transformation it had. Ears. By now Poirot no longer asked who had begun the whispers, for the more pressing question was why they had been allowed to continue. And have you ever noticed how wrongdoing survives less through secrecy than through cooperation, quiet, polite, and unspoken? Because on Whispering Isle the true accomplice was not a single person, but an agreement made years ago to look elsewhere. And Poirot saw how the whispers had begun only after that agreement had grown old enough to feel safe, old enough for conscience to relax. And it was then that the mind behind them acted, not out of vengeance, but out of precision, selecting moments when memory was weakest and fear most persuasive. And here Poirot assembled the final pieces not from sound but from silence, from the careful way certain names were avoided, from the way explanations arrived too quickly, as though rehearsed long before they were needed. And suddenly the whispers no longer felt supernatural at all, but instructional, teaching the island how to remember what it had rehearsed forgetting. And Poirot understood that the one responsible did not wish to terrify the innocent or expose the truth publicly, for exposure invites denial, but whispers invite listening, and listening invites admission. And as the realization settled, Poirot recognized the elegance of the design, for the whispers would cease only when their work was complete, when the island no longer needed reminding. And the most unsettling conclusion of all emerged quietly, that the true mystery of Whispering Isle was never how the whispers were created, but how easily they were obeyed. And once a community begins to answer a voice no one else can hear, the danger lies not in the sound itself, but in what people are willing to do to make it stop. Ears, asterisk, asterisk, and if whispers can be trained, if they can be taught when to arrive and whom to choose, then what does that say about the mind that releases them? Because as Poirot allowed the mystery of Whispering Isle to settle rather than rush it, he became interested not in the sound itself, but in its selectiveness, for not everyone heard the whispers, and not everyone heard the same thing. And does that not trouble you? The idea that fear might be tailored, adjusted delicately to suit its listener. Because those who dismissed the whispers tended to be those who had never truly listened to them, while those who heard them most clearly were those burdened by memory, by regret, by something unfinished. And Poirot, who never believed coincidence to be innocent, observed how the isle seemed to reward attentiveness and punish indifference, how the whispers appeared strongest where the past had been most carefully ignored, and slowly a picture emerged, not of superstition, but of opportunity. For islands, like secrets, are excellent at containing things, and histories, like tides, have a habit of returning whether invited or not. And as Poirot traced the pattern backward through time, he noticed how certain events had been quietly agreed upon as forgettable, how explanations have been accepted not because they were convincing but because they were convenient. And have you ever noticed how communities, much like individuals, prefer comfort over clarity, even when clarity is owed? And it was here that Poirot's interest sharpened, because whispers do not create guilt, they awaken it, and the isle's murmurs seemed less concerned with frightening the innocent than with reminding the guilty, arriving softly, persistently, as though rehearsed. And Poirot understood then that the whispers were not asking to be believed, only to be remembered, and memory, when neglected long enough, becomes restless, begins to press against the walls built to contain it. And if someone had learned how, ears, asterisk, asterisk, and as the sunlight fully embraced Whispering Isle, Poirot reflected once more on the delicate mastery of influence he had witnessed. For have you ever noticed how the smallest, most consistent gestures can leave the deepest impressions? How quiet reminders, repeated with care, can awaken thoughts and memories that were long ignored? Because here on this isolated isle, the whispers had done precisely that, guiding attention, shaping awareness, and subtly altering the rhythm of life, without ever demanding obedience. And Poirot, with his habitual precision, saw how every nuance of behavior, the careful closing of doors, the deliberate pacing of steps, the thoughtful pauses in conversation, spoke of a transformation more profound than any revelation. And is it not remarkable how the invisible patterns of suggestion, timing, and subtle guidance can teach lessons that loud proclamations never could? How the past, once neglected, can be coaxed into memory without confrontation, and how the mind, once nudged gently, can carry awareness far beyond the reach of any outside instruction. And the whispers themselves, now fully silent, had left behind a legacy that was at once invisible and undeniable, a quiet insistence that each listener acknowledged truths they had long avoided. And as Poirot prepared to depart the isle completely, watching the waves lap gently against rocks that had witnessed centuries of hidden stories, he understood that the true genius of this mystery lay not in the sound of the whispers, nor in any dramatic unveiling, but in the patient, meticulous shaping of perception, in the slow cultivation of reflection and conscience. And perhaps, if one listens closely in life, we too might encounter such subtle, instructive whispers, guiding us, teaching us, and reminding us that the most enduring mysteries are not those we uncover, but those that quietly change us, leaving us forever more attentive, more thoughtful, and infinitely more aware of the truths. Ears, asterisk, asterisk, and in the quiet that followed, Poirot realized that some mysteries are less about uncovering facts and more about understanding the human heart. For have you ever noticed how a small, consistent sound, a whisper repeated just often enough, can awaken thoughts long buried, memories carefully avoided, and feelings that have never been named? Because Whispering Owl had done precisely that, teaching patience, attentiveness, and reflection through the most delicate of methods. And it was not fear that lingered there, but awareness, a slow, persistent consciousness that seeped into every gesture, every glance, and every pause in conversation. And Poirot, with his meticulous eye and careful mind, observed how the islanders adjusted their lives almost imperceptibly, doors closing more deliberately, footsteps falling more softly, conversations carrying a new weight. And do we not all, when reminded of what we have forgotten, change in ways that no one else notices, subtle, almost invisible, yet profoundly real? And it became clear to him that the whispers were not intended to reveal a villain or unmask a culprit, but to awaken an understanding, a recognition that the past, however politely concealed, cannot be ignored indefinitely. And as he reflected on the patterns, the silences, and the small acts of caution, Poirot understood the extraordinary elegance of the design. For the mystery was never merely about what was done or said, but about how the invisible currents of awareness could reshape a community without a single dramatic confrontation. And as the sun began to lower toward the horizon, casting long, reflective shadows over the waters of the isle, he appreciated that the whispers, now fading entirely, had accomplished their task, leaving behind a quiet, enduring transformation, a lesson that the mind carries long after the sound has disappeared, and that some mysteries, like the gentle insistence of a whisper, do not end. They simply invite those who listen. Ears, asterisk, asterisk. And so Poirot understood that the final act of this mystery would not arrive with noise or confession, but with a choice. For when whispers have finished teaching their lesson, they no longer need to speak at all. And have you ever considered how silence can feel heavier than sound once the truth has been learned? Because on Whispering Owl the murmurs faded, not suddenly, but respectfully, as though acknowledging that their purpose had been fulfilled, and in their absence something far more difficult took their place. The burden of recognition. For those who had listened now understood what had been asked of them. Not punishment, not spectacle, but remembrance. And Poirot saw how the island changed once more, not through relief, but through restraint, as habits shifted back only partially, as lights were still left on, as doors were still closed carefully, not out of fear but out of awareness. And the past, once forced into the open by sound, now lived openly in thought. And Poirot, satisfied yet unsmiling, knew that justice does not always arrive in the form of consequence. Sometimes it arrives as permanence, a truth that cannot be silenced again. And as he prepared to leave the isle, he reflected that the most effective mysteries are those that solve themselves once the listener is ready. For Whispering Owl no longer whispered, and yet nothing there would ever truly be quiet again. And if you listen closely to places you believe have forgotten their past, you may discover, as Poirot did, that silence is not the absence of sound, but the moment after understanding, when there is nothing left to say and everything left to remember. For once a mind begins to listen for meaning rather than sound, it becomes impossible to ignore how carefully fear arranges itself. And Poirot now understood that Whispering Owl was not reacting to the whispers at all, but responding to them, adjusting, yielding, confessing in ways no one dared do aloud. And is it not remarkable how a suggestion, softly delivered, can reshape behavior more effectively than any command? Because as the days passed, the whispers began to influence choices rather than emotions, steering people away from certain paths, drawing them toward others, and always with a gentleness that felt almost considerate. And Poirot noticed how those who had once spoken freely now weighed each word, how laughter arrived later and departed sooner, how trust thinned not through accusation, but through anticipation. And this, Poirot believed, was the true purpose of the whispers, not to expose, but to isolate, For isolation creates reflection, and reflection, when guided, becomes revelation. And as he examined the fragments of history that clung to the isle like mist, he saw how one long-ago incident had been smoothed over with civility and silence, how responsibility had been shared so thinly that no single conscience felt the full weight of it, and yet guilt, unlike blame, cannot be divided so neatly. It lingers, waiting for a voice. And Poirot realized then that someone had learned how to give that guilt a rhythm, repeating it just often enough to keep it alive and not a moment more. And here the pattern at last revealed its shape, for the whispers grew clearer, not where the past was unknown, but where it had been most carefully rewritten, and Poirot felt the shift that always preceded understanding, that quiet moment when confusion gives way to design, and the most unsettling thought of all presented itself, that the whispers were not a message meant to be decoded, but a mirror, held up patiently until those who heard it recognized themselves. Within it, asterisk, and even as the boat carried Poirot away from Whispering Isle, the detective could not help but ponder the invisible threads that had tied the islanders' lives together. For have you ever considered how a place, much like a memory, can shape behavior without uttering a single word? How silence, when carefully orchestrated, becomes more instructive than speech. Because on that isle, every whispered pause had acted like a gentle hand, guiding conscience, testing patience, measuring attentiveness. And the more Poirot reflected, the more he recognized that the true genius of the mystery lay not in its revelation, but in its slow insistence, its insistence that each individual confront the fragments of themselves they had long ignored. And do we not all possess such fragments, carefully tucked away, avoided in polite conversation, left unexamined until some subtle, persistent voice, real or imagined, forces acknowledgement? And it was here, in that quiet understanding, that Poirot saw the whisper's ultimate purpose, for they were never meant to frighten, nor to punish, but to instruct, to awaken recognition that could not be imposed through argument or force. And as the shoreline receded behind him, he thought of the islanders, how each would carry these lessons forward in small, almost invisible ways, how they would pause before speaking, how they might glance over a shoulder at a shadow that previously would have gone unnoticed, and perhaps most importantly, how they would remember in a quiet, intimate way that someone or something had asked them to listen, had asked them to reconsider what they had long allowed to pass. And is it not remarkable, Poirot thought, that true mystery does not end with an answer, but persists in reflection, in the subtle reshaping of daily life, in the echo of awareness that follows those who pay attention. And as the horizon swallowed the isle, he understood that mysteries like these, delicate, patient, and profoundly human, leave a. And as Poirot finally stepped away from the shore, leaving Whispering Isle to its quiet secrets, he could not help but reflect on how the subtleties of human behavior reveal themselves in ways far more telling than any dramatic act. For have you ever considered how gentle persistence, repeated observation, and careful timing can alter the course of thought and memory? How the faintest whisper can awaken reflection, shape conscience, and instill awareness without a single outward confrontation? Because here, on this isolated isle, the whispers had acted like invisible teachers, guiding the islanders through their own unspoken regrets, overlooked duties, and quietly buried truths. And Poirot, with his customary attention to detail, observed how these lessons had taken root in ways both subtle and profound. The deliberate pacing of steps, the considered weight of words, the lingering glances at corners once ignored, small signs that the mind had been shaped without its full understanding. And is it not remarkable how awareness can spread silently, almost imperceptibly, until it becomes a part of daily life, teaching reflection and vigilance more effectively than any outward admonition? And as he watched the early morning light ripple across the water, illuminating paths that had long carried hidden histories, he understood that the true resolution of this mystery lay not in uncovering culprits or exposing faults, but in the quiet transformation it had instilled, the invisible. imprint left on every corner of thought and habit. And even now, as the isle returned to its ordinary rhythms, the echoes of those whispers remained, not as sound, but as awareness, a persistent, patient reminder that the most enduring lessons often arrive not with spectacle, but with subtle insistence, guiding those who are willing to listen, teaching that understanding is rarely immediate, and that sometimes the most profound mysteries are the ones that change us quietly, invisibly, and forever. Asterisk, asterisk. And even after the whispers had ceased, Poirot lingered in thought, because the mind is never satisfied with a story merely concluded. And have you ever noticed how mysteries persist in the quiet corners of memory, where no one else is watching, shaping the way we move, speak, and remember? Because on whispering, all the silence that followed the whispers was heavier than any sound that had come before, and it carried lessons far more subtle and persistent, teaching the islanders, and perhaps even Poirot himself, that vigilance is not about watching others, but about noticing what they cannot say, what they suppress, what they rehearse only in solitude. And here the detective observed how life had changed imperceptibly, how routines adjusted in small, respectful ways, how conversations now carried a careful weight, and how the very air seemed to hum with acknowledgement, a quiet agreement that the past could no longer be ignored. And do we not all carry a whispering isle within us, places where truths once forgotten linger just beneath the surface, waiting for someone wise enough to hear them? And Poirot, with his habitual calm and meticulous attention, recognized the genius not in the creation of fear, but in the way it was delivered gradually, deliberately, until the island itself had learned the lesson of listening, of remembering, and of reckoning. And though the solution had been revealed, the impact remained ongoing, for a mystery is never entirely concluded until its echoes are felt, its lessons embedded in habits, in glances, in the silence between words. And as he walked away, the faintest hint of a whisper reached his ear, not threatening, not revealing, but reminding, and Poirot understood that some truths are so delicate, so patient, that they do not scream for attention. They simply wait, shaping those who listen long after the source is gone, leaving the island. And perhaps us, forever changed. Ears, asterisk, asterisk. And as Poirot's gaze lingered on the fading silhouette of Whispering Isle, he reflected on the subtle, almost invisible lessons that had been imparted. For have you ever noticed how small, repeated nudges can leave a deeper mark than any dramatic revelation? How the mind, when guided with patience and precision, learns more from quiet reflection than from loud instruction. Because on this island the whispers had done more than unsettle. They had reshaped thought, memory, and behavior, teaching the inhabitants to notice what they had long ignored, to pause before speaking, to consider the unseen. And Poirot, meticulous as ever, observed the gentle changes everywhere, the deliberate closing of doors, the cautious pacing along familiar paths, the thoughtful silences that now punctuated conversation. And is it not curious how awareness can spread silently, invisibly, until it becomes a new rhythm of life, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly transformative? And the whispers themselves, though now absent, had left a lingering effect, a quiet insistence that truths once overlooked could no longer be avoided, that memory demands recognition, and that reflection, once awakened, cannot be silenced. And as he watched the sunlight shimmer across the water, touching every rock, every hidden nook, Poirot understood that the true genius of the mystery lay not in uncovering wrongdoing, nor in dramatic revelation, but in the patient shaping of perception, the careful guidance of attention, and the subtle orchestration of thought. For the most enduring mysteries do not merely reveal. They transform, leaving behind lessons embedded in the habits, glances, and silences of those who listen. And perhaps, if we ourselves are attentive enough in life, we may encounter whispers of our own, quiet, deliberate, and instructive, reminding us that understanding often arrives not in noise, but in patience, subtlety, and the gentle insistence of reflection. leaving us forevermore. As the waves whispered softly against the shores of Whispering Isle, Poirot considered how mysteries often linger far longer than the events themselves. For have you ever noticed how certain lessons embed themselves quietly in the mind, shaping thought, influencing behavior, and subtly guiding decisions without anyone noticing? Because here, on this small, isolated isle, the whispers had done precisely that, awakening awareness, prompting reflection, and stirring memory that had long been ignored. And Poirot, with his habitual precision, observed how these quiet interventions had reshaped daily life. The deliberate gestures, the measured conversations, the careful attention to corners that had once been overlooked. And is it not remarkable how invisible influence can be more profound than visible action? How repetition, timing, and subtle guidance can awaken insight far more effectively than revelation or accusation. And the whispers themselves, though now silent, left an enduring impression, a soft insistence that the past, however politely forgotten, cannot be fully ignored, that conscience, once stirred, demands recognition. And Poirot, watching the interplay of light and shadow on the isle, realized that the genius of this mystery lay not in exposing wrongs or identifying culprits, but in transforming perception, in creating a persistent awareness that would ripple through behavior long after the last whisper had faded. And perhaps the most extraordinary truth of all is that some mysteries do not end with answers. They endure quietly, invisibly, reshaping minds, embedding lessons, and reminding those who listen that the softest sounds often carry the greatest wisdom, leaving us forever more vigilant, forever more reflective, and forever more attuned to the subtle truths that lie beneath the surface of the ordinary surface of life. If you want, I can now compile all 19 modules into a single, ready-to-use video script with a clear progression of curiosity hooks, tension, and closure for your YouTube video. This will make it perfect for senior audiences, Miss Marple/Poirot style. Do you want me to do that